Miguel immediately signaled for them to get back into the river and crouched behind a large boulder that partially blocked the view from shore. The voices were getting closer, and Sarah could now make out individual words. "The tracks led to the water here," one man was saying. "They probably went downstream to throw off the dogs." "Set up positions along both banks," another voice commanded. "They have to come out of the water somewhere. When they do, we'll be waiting." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard, she was afraid the sound might give them away. Through gaps between the rocks, she could see armed men moving through the trees along both sides of the river. They were dressed in military-style clothing, but without official insignia, the uniform of paramilitary groups throughout Colombia. Anna was pressed against the boulder next to her, clutching the waterproof bag containing her evidence. Her face was pale but determined. Miguel was studying the terrain, looking for any possible escape route. The men were setting up what appeared to be a systematic search pattern. Sarah counted at least 8 on their side of the river, and could hear more voices from the opposite bank. They were trapped. "We need to create a diversion," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "What kind of diversion?" Sarah asked. Miguel reached into his backpack and pulled out a small emergency flare. "I'm going to move downstream about 200 meters and set this off. When they go to investigate, you and Anna move upstream and cross at the narrow point we passed about 10 minutes ago." "What about you?" Anna asked. "I'll meet you at the crossing if I can. If not, keep going toward the military base. Don't wait for me." Before either woman could protest, Miguel slipped away, moving carefully through the water close to the bank. Sarah watched him disappear around a bend in the river, then turned her attention back to the armed men. They were spreading out along the riverbank, clearly planning to wait for their targets to emerge. Some were setting up what looked like night vision equipment, suggesting they were prepared for a long hunt. Sarah checked her watch. It was already late afternoon, and darkness would fall in a few hours. That might work in their favor. If they could evade capture until nightfall, they would have a better chance of reaching the military base. Suddenly, a brilliant red flare exploded in the sky downstream, followed by shouts from the armed men. "There, 200 meters down." Most of the men immediately ran toward the flare, leaving only 2 guards in Sarah and Anna's immediate area. This was their chance. Moving as quietly as possible, they slipped back into the water and began working their way upstream. The current was against them now, making progress slow and difficult, but the noise of rushing water helped mask any sounds they made. When they reached the narrow crossing point Miguel had mentioned, Sarah could see it was still partially guarded. One man with an assault rifle was positioned on the far bank, scanning the water with binoculars. Anna pointed to a section of the bank where thick vegetation hung down to the water's edge. If they could reach that spot without being seen, they might be able to climb out undetected. They moved inch by inch, using submerged rocks for cover. Sarah's photographer training in Afghanistan had taught her how to move without being detected, but this was different. One wrong move, one careless sound, and it would all be over. Just as they reached the vegetation, Sarah heard more shouts from downstream. Either Miguel had been captured or killed, or he had managed to create another diversion. Either way, she knew they were running out of time. Anna went first, pulling herself up the muddy bank using tree roots and branches. Sarah followed, her wet clothes making every movement more difficult. When they finally reached solid ground, they were both covered in mud and breathing heavily. But they were also exposed. The forest here was thinner than where they had been before, offering less cover from aerial surveillance. Almost immediately, they could hear the sound of helicopters returning. "We need to reach the thick canopy," Anna said, pointing to a section of older forest about half a kilometer away. They ran, abandoning any attempt at stealth for pure speed. Behind them, Sarah could hear more shouts as their tracks were discovered. The hunt was intensifying. When they reached the older forest, Sarah collapsed against a tree trunk, completely exhausted. But Anna grabbed her arm and pulled her back to her feet. "No time to rest," Anna said urgently. "Listen." Sarah could hear it too, the sound of vehicles, probably all-terrain motorcycles, moving through the forest in their direction. Their pursuers had brought in additional resources. "How far to the military base?" Sarah gasped. Anna consulted Miguel's map, which she had taken from his backpack before they separated. maybe 8 kilometers. But it's almost straight up the mountain from here. They began climbing again, but the terrain was punishing. The slope was steep and covered with loose rocks that threatened to send them tumbling back down with every step. Sarah's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she could see that Anna was struggling too. As darkness began to fall, they heard the helicopters again, this time equipped with powerful searchlights that swept through the forest below them. The beams of light looked like deadly fingers, probing every shadow. "They're using thermal imaging," Anna said. "Our body heat will show up even in darkness." They needed to find a way to mask their heat signature. Anna led them to a small cave formed by fallen boulders. It wasn't much, but the rocks would provide some protection from thermal detection. Inside the cave, they finally had a chance to assess their situation. Both women were exhausted, dehydrated, and still hours away from safety. Worse, they could hear the sound of their pursuers getting closer. "Sarah," Anna said quietly, "I need you to take the USB drive now." She pulled the small device from her. Sarah felt her heart sink as Roberto's words hit her. 40 armed men searching for them meant this was no longer just a dangerous assignment. It was a potential death sentence for everyone in the community. "How far away are they?" she asked. "Our scouts say they were seen 15 kilometers downstream this morning," Roberto replied. "At their pace, they could reach us by evening." Miguel grabbed Sarah's arm. "We should leave now. We can take you back to Quibdó before they arrive." But Sarah shook her head. "I didn't come this far to turn around now. Where's Anna?" Roberto hesitated, glancing at the other community members. Finally, he motioned for them to follow him along one of the wooden walkways that connected the houses. They passed women cooking over open fires, children playing with handmade toys, and men repairing fishing nets. It struck Sarah how normal life continued even in the face of constant danger. They stopped at a small house at the far edge of the settlement. Roberto knocked in a specific pattern, and a woman's voice answered from inside. After a brief exchange in the indigenous language, the door opened. Ana Gutierrez was not what Sarah had expected. She was younger than Sarah had imagined, probably in her early 30s, with long dark hair and intelligent brown eyes. But there was a hardness in her expression that spoke of someone who had seen too much violence and loss. "So you're the journalist who's going to save us all," Ana said in perfect English, with only a slight accent. "I studied at Universidad Nacional in Bogotá before I came back here to teach." "I'm here to listen," Sarah said, "and to help tell your story to the world." Ana studied her for a moment, then stepped aside to let them enter. The house was simple but clean, with a small table, 2 chairs, and a bed in one corner. But what immediately caught Sarah's attention were the stacks of documents, photographs, and electronic devices covering every available surface. "This is my evidence," Ana said, gesturing to the materials. 3 years of work documenting the connections between foreign mining companies, local politicians, and paramilitary groups. Names, dates, bank account numbers, photographs of meetings, recorded conversations. Sarah looked at the photographs scattered across the table. They showed men in expensive suits shaking hands with men in military uniforms. Other photos captured mining equipment in protected areas, dead fish floating in contaminated rivers, and mass graves in the forest. "This is incredible," Sarah said. "How did you get all this?" "By being very careful and very patient," Anna replied. "And by watching 12 of my colleagues die for getting too close to the truth." Anna picked up a thick folder and opened it. Inside were detailed financial records showing payments from 3 major mining companies to bank accounts linked to paramilitary groups. "The companies claim they're operating legally," Anna explained. "They have permits from the Colombian government. But those permits were obtained through bribes, and the actual mining is happening far outside the permitted areas, in protected indigenous lands and nature reserves." She pulled out a map covered with colored markers. Red areas showed illegal mining sites, blue areas showed contaminated water sources, and black X's marked locations where environmental activists had been killed or disappeared. "The paramilitaries provide security for the mining operations," Anna continued. "They keep journalists away, intimidate local officials who might cause problems, and eliminate anyone who gathers evidence against the companies." Sarah was taking notes frantically, but She was also very aware of the ticking clock. Anna, we may only have a few hours before those armed men arrive. Can you give me the most important evidence to take with me? I'm not giving you anything to take with you, Anna said firmly. I'm coming with you. Roberto, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Anna, that's suicide. If you leave the protection of the community, they will kill you before you reach Quibdo. They're going to kill me anyway, Anna replied. At least this way, the evidence might survive. I've made copies of everything and hidden them in different locations. But I'm the only one who understands all the connections, who can explain how the network operates. Sarah felt torn between her professional excitement at getting such an important source and her human concern for Anna's safety. There has to be another way. We could arrange for you to speak to my editors by satellite phone, or we could bring international observers here to document your evidence. Anna laughed bitterly. You think this is the first time someone has tried that? 6 months ago, a team from Human Rights Watch was supposed to visit this region. Their helicopter was shot down, supposedly by accident. All 4 investigators died. She walked to the window and looked out at the peaceful community. These people have protected me for months, but I can't ask them to die for me. When those 40 men arrive, they won't just be looking for me. They'll torture and kill anyone they suspect of helping me. Miguel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. There might be another way. There's an old smuggling route through the mountains that leads to a government military base about 60 kilometers from here. If we can reach that base, Anna would be under official protection. How long would it take? Sarah asked. On foot, through difficult terrain, maybe 18 hours. But it means leaving now, and it means traveling through territory controlled by the paramilitaries. Anna was already gathering her most important documents and putting them into a waterproof bag. It's better than waiting here to die. Roberto looked unhappy but resigned. I'll organize a distraction. Some of our young men will take boats in the opposite direction, make noise, leave false trails. Maybe it will buy you some time. As they prepared to leave, Anna gave Sarah a crash course in the evidence she had gathered. The corruption network was more extensive than Sarah had realized. It involved not just mining companies and paramilitaries, but also officials in the Colombian military, environmental ministry, and even judges who had dismissed cases against the companies. The companies are mostly registered in Canada and Australia, Anna explained. They use Colombian shell companies to hide their involvement. But I've traced the money flows. The same bank accounts that receive payments for environmental permits also receive payments for weapons and ammunition purchases by paramilitary groups. Sarah was recording everything on her digital recorder, but she was also very aware that Anna was essentially signing her own death warrant by sharing this information. They left the community through a back trail as the sun reached its peak. Roberto and several other men accompanied them for the first few kilometers, showing them the route and helping to carry supplies. When they reached a fork in the trail, Roberto stopped. From here, you're on your own, he said. Follow this path up the mountain. Stay away from the main rivers. That's where they'll be looking for you. Sarah shook Roberto's hand. Thank you for protecting Anna. And I'm sorry we brought this danger to your community. The danger was already here, Roberto replied. We've been living with it for years. Maybe now the world will finally pay attention. The mountain trail was brutal. Sarah was in good shape from years of covering conflicts in difficult terrain, but the humidity and steep inclines quickly exhausted her. Anna moved more easily, accustomed to the environment, but even she was breathing hard as they climbed higher into the cloud forest. Miguel led the way, using a machete to cut through thick vegetation where the trail disappeared. Every few hundred meters, he would stop to listen for sounds of pursuit. The forest was full of noise, bird calls, insect sounds, the crash of branches falling in the distance, making it difficult to distinguish natural sounds from human activity. After 4 hours of hiking, they reached a small clearing where Miguel called for a rest. Sarah collapsed gratefully on a fallen log, her shirt soaked with sweat. Anna seemed less tired but equally relieved to stop. How are we doing on time? Sarah asked. Miguel checked his watch and looked at the sun filtering through the canopy. Better than I expected. If we maintain this pace, we should reach the military base by dawn. But their relief was short-lived. As they prepared to continue, Miguel held up his hand for silence. In the distance, they could hear the sound of helicopters. Military? Sarah asked hopefully. Miguel shook his head. Wrong type of sound. Those are civilian helicopters, the kind the mining companies use. Through gaps in the forest canopy, Sarah could see two helicopters circling the area they had just left. Even from this distance, she could see men with rifles hanging out of the aircraft. They're not just searching, Anna said quietly. They're hunting. The helicopters began moving in a systematic pattern, covering the forest below. It was clear that they had sophisticated equipment, probably thermal imaging that could detect body heat even through the forest canopy. We need to keep moving, Miguel said. But we have to be smarter about it. They'll be watching all the obvious routes. Instead of following the main trail, Miguel led them deeper into the forest, where the canopy was thicker and would provide better cover from aerial surveillance. But this meant much slower progress through nearly impenetrable vegetation. As they pushed through a particularly dense section of forest, Sarah's satellite phone suddenly came to life. She had forgotten that she had arranged for her editor to call at this time for a status update. Sarah, how's the story developing? Marcus's voice crackled through the connection. Sarah looked at Anna and Miguel, both of whom were listening intently. Marcus, I'm with Ana Gutierrez. She has evidence of a massive conspiracy involving mining companies, government officials, and paramilitary groups. But we're in serious danger. There are armed men hunting us. Are you safe where you are? For now. But we're trying to reach a military base where Anna can get protection. The evidence she has could bring down some very powerful people. There was a pause on the line. Sarah, I'm getting reports that the Colombian government is denying knowledge of any journalist in the Chaco region. They're saying if you're there, you're operating without proper authorization. Sarah felt a chill. If the government was denying her presence, it meant they were washing their hands of responsibility for her safety. Marcus, I need you to contact the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. Tell them where I am and who I'm with. Make sure this story gets out even if something happens to me. Sarah, maybe you should consider extraction. I can make some calls. The line went dead. Sarah looked at the phone. No signal. They were now completely cut off from the outside world. Government denial is not a good sign, Anna said. It means they've decided to let the mining companies handle this their own way. As if to emphasize her point, they heard the helicopters returning, this time much closer. The sound of rotor blades was almost directly overhead. Miguel motioned for them to take cover under a large tree with thick, low-hanging branches. They pressed themselves against the trunk and tried to remain motionless as one of the helicopters hovered just above the canopy. Sarah could hear voices shouting from the aircraft, but couldn't make out what they were saying. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the helicopter moved on. They know we're in this area, Miguel whispered. We need to change our route again. But, as they prepared to move, they heard something that made Sarah's blood freeze, the sound of dogs barking in the distance. Tracking dogs, Anna said. They must have brought them by helicopter to pick up our scent from the community. Miguel's expression was grim. Dogs change everything. They can follow our trail even through water, even if we try to confuse the scent. And they move much faster than we do. How far behind us are they? Sarah asked. Hard to tell. But if they started from the community, and they're using helicopters to move the dogs quickly, maybe 2 hours. The situation was rapidly becoming hopeless. They were exhausted, lost in dense forest, being hunted by men with helicopters and tracking dogs, and still had more than 10 hours of hiking before they could reach safety. But Anna surprised Sarah by seeming almost calm. I always knew it might end this way, she said. The important thing is that the evidence survives. Sarah, I need you to understand something. In my bag, I have a USB drive with all the key documents. Bank records, photographs, audio recordings of conversations between company executives and paramilitary leaders. If something happens to me, that drive needs to reach the outside world. Nothing is going to happen to you, Sarah said, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. There's a contact in Bogota, Anna continued, ignoring Sarah's words. Dr. Carmen Vega at Universidad Nacional. She's been helping me analyze the financial records. If you can get the USB drive to her, she knows how to authenticate everything and get it to international investigators. Miguel was studying his map. There's a river about 2 kilometers from here. If we can reach it, We might be able to throw off the dogs by traveling downstream. The water will wash away our scent." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was their only option. They set off again, moving as quickly as the thick vegetation would allow. Behind them, the sound of barking dogs was getting steadily closer. When they finally reached the river, Sarah was relieved to see it was deep enough to wade in but narrow enough to cross easily. The current was swift, and the water was shockingly cold after hours in the humid forest. "We follow the river downstream for at least an hour," Miguel said. "Try not to touch the banks if you can help it. Any scent we leave will give the dogs a new trail to follow." Wading downstream was exhausting work. The riverbed was rocky and uneven, and the current constantly threatened to knock them off their feet. But Sarah could no longer hear the dogs, which gave her hope that the plan was working. After an hour in the water, Miguel led them up onto the opposite bank. "From here, we climb," he said, pointing to a steep ridge covered in thick forest. "The military base is on the other side of that ridge." But as they began to climb out of the river, they heard a sound that made them all freeze. Human voices, speaking in Spanish, coming from the forest ahead of them. They were no longer being hunted from behind. They were walking into a trap. Sarah Martinez had always been drawn to dangerous places. As a war correspondent for International News Network, she had covered conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, and Somalia. But nothing had prepared her for what she would face in the remote mountains of Colombia. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Her editor, Marcus, had called her into his office on a rainy Tuesday morning in New York. "We need someone to investigate the disappearances," he had said, sliding a thick folder across his desk. 12 journalists have vanished in the past 18 months. All were working on stories about illegal mining operations in the Chaco region. Sarah opened the folder and studied the photographs of missing reporters. Their faces stared back at her, young and old, experienced and fresh-faced. Each had been investigating the same story: foreign companies illegally extracting gold from protected indigenous lands, with the help of armed paramilitary groups. "The Colombian government says they're handling it," Marcus continued, "but families of the missing journalists don't believe them. They think there's a cover-up. We need someone to go in and find out what really happened to these people." Sarah accepted the assignment without hesitation. She had spent years building sources in Latin America, and her Spanish was fluent. More importantly, she had a reputation for getting stories that others couldn't. Her fearless approach had won her 3 international journalism awards, but it had also cost her 2 marriages and countless nights of sleep. 3 weeks later, Sarah landed in Bogotá. The Colombian capital buzzed with traffic and street vendors, but beneath the surface, she could feel the tension that came from decades of conflict. She spent 2 days meeting with government officials who gave her polite but unhelpful answers about the missing journalists. "These are dangerous areas," Minister of Interior Carlos Vasquez told her over coffee in his downtown office. "We advise all foreign journalists to work with our media liaison office. For their own safety, of course." Sarah knew this was code for government control over what stories got told. She had no intention of working through official channels. Her first real break came from an unexpected source. Elena Rojas was the sister of Diego Rojas, a Colombian photographer who had disappeared 6 months earlier while investigating the mining story. Elena worked as a nurse in a public hospital, and she had been quietly gathering information about her brother's disappearance. They met in a small cafe in the La Candelaria neighborhood, surrounded by colonial buildings and the constant noise of the city. Elena was a small woman with tired eyes, but her voice was strong when she spoke about her brother. "Diego wasn't just any photographer," Elena said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "He grew up in Chaco. He knew the communities there, spoke the indigenous languages. That's why they killed him." "You think he's dead?" Sarah asked. "I know he is." Elena reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "This belonged to Diego. I found it hidden in his apartment after he disappeared. The police never searched properly." Sarah took the notebook and flipped through its pages. Diego had written in a mixture of Spanish and what looked like indigenous words. But there were also names, dates, and locations. One entry caught her attention: meeting with Carlos Mendoza, 15th of March, Quibdó. "He says the miners have protection from the top. Military involved." "Who is Carlos Mendoza?" Sarah asked. A local activist. He was helping my brother understand the connections between the mining companies and the paramilitaries. But Carlos disappeared 2 weeks after Diego. Elena leaned forward, lowering her voice even though the cafe was nearly empty. There's someone else. A woman named Ana Gutierrez. She's a teacher in one of the indigenous communities. She's been documenting everything. The environmental damage, the threats against community leaders, the payments to local officials. My brother was supposed to meet with her before he disappeared. Is she still alive? As far as I know. But she's in hiding. The paramilitaries have put a price on her head. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with getting close to a real story. Can you help me contact her? Elena hesitated. It's very dangerous. These people don't just threaten journalists. They kill them. And they kill anyone who helps them. I understand the risks, Sarah said. But if we don't tell this story, more people will disappear. Your brother's work will be for nothing. That evening, Elena made some phone calls. By morning, she had arranged for Sarah to meet with a contact who could potentially put her in touch with Ana Gutierrez. But the meeting would have to take place in Quibdó, the capital of Chaco province, deep in Colombia's Pacific coast region. Sarah took a commercial flight to Quibdó the next day. The plane descended through thick clouds over endless green rainforest. She could see rivers winding through the jungle like silver snakes. This was one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, but it was also one of the poorest and most violent. Quibdó was a city that felt like it existed on the edge of the world. Most of the buildings were low and weathered, painted in fading tropical colors. The streets were a mixture of pavement and mud, depending on how recently it had rained. And it rained a lot. Chaco was one of the wettest places on the planet. Sarah checked into a small hotel near the center of town. The owner, a middle-aged man named Joaquin, looked nervous when she told him she was a journalist. You should be careful, he said in accented English. This is not a good place for asking questions. That evening, Sarah met her contact at a bar called El Pacifico. The man introduced himself only as Miguel. He was tall and thin, with the weathered look of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. His eyes constantly scanned the room as they talked. You want to speak with Ana Gutierrez, Miguel said. It wasn't a question. Elena Rojas said you might be able to help. Miguel drank his beer slowly before responding. Ana is hiding in an indigenous community about 4 hours from here by boat. The river is the only way in or out. It's dangerous territory. The paramilitaries control most of the area. But you know how to get there? I know the river. I've been fishing these waters since I was a boy. But I won't take you unless you understand what you're walking into. Miguel explained that the region had been controlled by various armed groups for decades. First the FARC guerrillas, then paramilitaries, and now criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking and illegal mining. The government had little presence outside the main towns. The mining companies pay for protection, Miguel said. They hire men with guns to keep journalists and activists away from their operations. Some of these men are former paramilitaries. Others are just criminals. But they're all dangerous. Sarah had worked in war zones before, but something about Miguel's tone made her pause. How dangerous are we talking about? Last month, they found 3 bodies floating in the Atrato River. Environmental activists from Medellin who were investigating mercury contamination from the gold mining. They had been tortured before they were killed. The bar had grown quieter as the evening progressed. Sarah noticed that other customers seemed to be keeping their distance from their table. Ana Gutierrez has been documenting everything, Miguel continued. She has photographs, videos, financial records showing payments from mining companies to paramilitary groups. She has testimony from community members who witnessed killings. If this information gets out, it could bring down some very powerful people. Then, why hasn't she already released it? She tried to. She gave copies to a journalist from El Espectador newspaper in Bogotá. That journalist was killed in a car accident 2 days later. Ana realized she needed to be more careful about who she trusted. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. And, she's willing to trust me? She's willing to meet you. Whether she trusts you will depend on what you say to her. They arranged to meet the next morning at dawn. Miguel would take Sarah upriver to the indigenous community where Ana was hiding. The journey would be dangerous, but it was the only way to get the story. That night, Sarah lay awake in her hotel room. listening to the sounds of the rainforest outside her window. She thought about the 12 missing journalists, about Diego Rojas, and his hidden notebook, about Ana Gutierrez hiding in the jungle with evidence that could expose a massive conspiracy. She also thought about the risks. Her experience in other conflict zones had taught her to trust her instincts. And right now her instincts were telling her that this assignment was more dangerous than anything she had faced before. But the story was too important to walk away from. Just after midnight, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. They stopped in front of her door. Sarah held her breath, waiting. After what felt like several minutes, the footsteps moved away. She got up and looked out the window. A black SUV was parked across the street, its engine running. As she watched, a man got out and looked up at her window. Even in the dim street light, she could see that he was carrying a weapon. Sarah stepped back from the window and quickly gathered her things. She had learned long ago that when armed men started watching you, it was time to change your plans. She slipped out the back entrance of the hotel and made her way through the dark streets to Miguel's house. Miguel lived in a small wooden house on stilts near the river. Sarah knocked quietly on his door, and he appeared after a few moments, fully dressed. "They're watching me," she said. Miguel nodded grimly. "I was expecting this. We need to leave now, while it's still dark." They made their way to the riverbank where Miguel kept his boat. It was a long, narrow wooden vessel with an outboard motor, the kind locals use to navigate the shallow rivers of the region. Sarah climbed in, and Miguel pushed off from the shore. As they moved into the current, Sarah looked back at Quibdó. The city was mostly dark, but she could see lights moving along the waterfront. Someone was looking for her. The river was black under the moonless sky. Miguel navigated by memory and instinct, avoiding fallen trees and shallow areas. The only sounds were the motor and the calls of night birds from the surrounding forest. "How long until we reach the community?" Sarah asked. "If we don't run into trouble, about 4 hours," Miguel replied. But trouble has a way of finding people on this river. They had been traveling for about an hour when Miguel suddenly cut the motor. The boat drifted silently in the current. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. Miguel pointed ahead. In the distance, she could see lights moving on the water. As they got closer, Sarah could make out the shape of a larger boat with several men on board. "Armed patrol," Miguel said quietly. "We need to hide." He guided the boat toward the shore, using a paddle to avoid making noise with the motor. They slipped under the overhanging branches of a large tree just as the patrol boat rounded the bend. Sarah could see at least 6 men on the boat, all carrying assault rifles. They were using spotlights to scan the shoreline. She held her breath as the light passed over their hiding spot, but the thick foliage concealed them. The patrol boat continued downriver, but Miguel waited another 10 minutes before starting the motor again. "That was close," Sarah said. "Too close. They're not usually patrolling this early in the morning. Someone must have told them to look for us." As dawn broke over the rainforest, Sarah began to understand just how isolated they were. The river wound through endless jungle, with no signs of human habitation except for occasional clearings where illegal miners had destroyed the forest in their search for gold. The environmental damage was worse than she had expected. Entire sections of riverbank had been stripped bare, and the water had a strange reddish tint from mercury and other chemicals used in the mining process. "This is what Ana has been documenting," Miguel said. "The mining companies tell the government they're following environmental regulations, but you can see the truth for yourself." Sarah took photographs of the devastation, but she knew pictures couldn't capture the full scope of what was happening here. This was an ecological disaster on a massive scale, hidden in one of the most remote regions of Colombia. As they rounded another bend, Miguel pointed to a small settlement on the riverbank. A few dozen wooden houses on stilts were scattered among the trees, connected by narrow walkways. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Sarah could see people moving about their daily activities. "This is the community where Ana is staying," Miguel said. "But we need to be very careful. Even here, there are people who work for the mining companies. They pay for information about journalists and activists." They pulled the boat up to a small dock. Several community members had gathered to watch their arrival. An older man with graying hair stepped forward to greet them. He spoke to Miguel in what Sarah recognized as an indigenous language. After a brief conversation, the man turned to Sarah. You are the journalist? He asked in Spanish. Yes, I'm here to speak with Ana Gutierrez. The man studied her for a long moment. My name is Roberto Cuesta. I am the leader of this community. Ana told us you might come. But she also told us that coming here would put all of us in danger. Sarah looked around at the faces watching her. These were people who had already suffered so much from the violence and environmental destruction caused by illegal mining. The last thing she wanted was to make their situation worse. I understand the risks, she said, but the world needs to know what's happening here. Ana has evidence that could expose the people responsible for killing journalists and destroying your land. Roberto nodded slowly. Ana is waiting for you. But first, you must understand something. Yesterday, we received word that armed men are moving through the forest. 40 of them, heavily armed. They are searching for Ana. And now they are searching for you.